They say single women are incomplete. But what if solitude is the exact place where a woman becomes whole? In a world that defines her by who she loves, what happens when she chooses to love herself first? Jung didn't see loneliness. He saw initiation, and once you understand what's truly happening beneath the silence, you'll never see being alone the same way again. Solitude as a path to individuation. Some people confuse being alone with being lost, but Jung saw something far deeper in solitude, a portal inward to that secret place where everything we avoid lives. That's where individuation begins. When the mask falls and truth starts to whisper, the question is, can you stand to listen? Living alone, especially as a woman, still carries symbolic weight. Society looks at her and projects its fears. Is she too much, too cold, broken? But that says more about them than her. Maybe this woman is making the boldest move of all, turning inward, and that's where authenticity begins. Because in solitude, there's no one left to hide behind, no partner to fill the gaps, no distractions to dull the silence. It's just you and what you really are. This confrontation is brutal, but essential. Without it, self-knowledge is just a fantasy. When a woman chooses to step away from the noise, she's not running. She's diving into her own inner process, digging through forgotten layers of the soul. Jung called this individuation a birth of a new consciousness. And that kind of birth happens in the dark, in silence. And from that silence, something begins to rise. It's not a better version of herself like self-help books promise. It's something raw, real, something that no longer craves approval or follows a script. It's a woman becoming whole, even if the world misunderstands. Maybe that's exactly why she becomes dangerous. Solitude becomes a laboratory, a sacred place where she experiments with independence, not as rebellion but liberation. She learns to trust her intuition, to stop asking for permission to exist, and even small acts, lighting a candle, brewing coffee, become rituals. Everything becomes symbolic. And here's the beautiful part. She realizes she's never truly alone. Inside her are ancestral voices, forgotten wisdom, the wild woman archetype, the healer, the one who dances in fire. That's when refuge appears, not as escape, but as return. A home inside her own chest. This home is sacred. There's no sign on the door, no manual. It's built with silence, patience, conscious choices. There she learns to honor her rhythms, her cycles. And without even noticing, she creates a space where her soul breathes. A space no relationship, if no matter how loving, can replace. The irony? As she walks this path, she becomes less dependent, and that threatens people. It threatens those who still think love only grows out of need. But true love is born between two whole people, people who don't complete, but overflow. She understood that Jung would say this is a reunion with the self, not the ego, not the persona, but what pulses way beneath, waiting to be seen, and when she finally sees it, she can't unsee. The woman who has walked through solitude will never be the same, but let's be real. This process hurts. Some days feel like abandonment. Some nights stretch forever. The inner resistance screams, trying to sabotage. The fear whispers, what if you end up alone forever? And she replies, maybe, but at least I'll be myself until the end. That's spiritual courage. And here's a paradox. The deeper she goes, the wider she becomes. The more isolated, the more connected. Because in the quiet, compassion blooms. Creativity wakes up. Presence returns. Solitude isn't a wall. It's a bridge inward and strangely outward too. Along this bridge, she sees through projections, other people's fears, expectations, labels. They lose power in the light of awareness. Because when you build your identity without relying on external approval, you become unshakable. That's social authenticity in its purest form. So this solitary woman, she's not fragile, she's fierce. Not because she attacks, but because she doesn't need. She stared into her own abyss and chose to stay. That terrifies people. It reveals how shallow most lives are. But she lives in the depths, in the symbolic, in the real, and perhaps the most striking part, as she walks this road, she integrates her animus. Her inner masculine grows stronger, not as a tyrant, but as an ally. She learns to be rational, without becoming rigid, assertive without losing tenderness, and this psychic balance. It changes everything. In the end, solitude isn't about being alone. It's about coming home. It's a return to the sacred, the instinctual, the invisible. But this return requires surrender, and surrender requires stillness. And in that stillness, her soul finally whispers, "You've arrived," confronting the shadow and integrating the animus. There's a part of you you've spent years avoiding. It hides in your silence, leaks through your triggers, and whispers in your fears. Jung called it the shadow, the rejected, repressed self that you swore wasn't you. But in solitude, that shadow has nowhere to hide. It shows up and demands to be seen. Living alone becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They reflect what you are, not what you pretend to be. Suddenly, the fear of abandonment, the need for validation, the self-sabotage, it all surfaces. This is the work. The ugly, raw, transformative inner process no one warned you about, and yet it's the beginning of freedom. Because the moment you stop running from your shadow, you start reclaiming your power. You begin to own the parts of you that used to shame you. That's how self-knowledge works, not through feel-good affirmations, but through radical honesty with your darkest self. The woman who faces her shadow is terrifying. Not to herself, but to others, because she's no longer manipulable. You can't guilt her, flatter her, or control her with expectations. She's seen her own demons, and they didn't break her. That's what psychic balance really means. But here's the twist. The shadow isn't evil. It's misunderstood. It holds your creative fire, your repressed anger, your wild truth. It's the part of you that screams for authenticity in a world obsessed with performance. Integrating it doesn't make you darker, it makes you real. Now enter the animus. The masculine energy within every woman, often distorted, ignored, or projected onto men. But in solitude, there's no man to carry that projection. So she meets it internally. She begins to notice when she's passive, indecisive, overly emotional, and reclaims her strength from within. The animus shows up not as dominance, but as direction. It helps her speak with clarity, act with intention, move with purpose. It's not about becoming masculine. It's about integrating power without losing softness. That's what Jung meant by integration, a union of opposites within the psyche. This process is uncomfortable. She might find herself arguing with old versions of herself, the one who said yes when she meant no, the one who smiled to avoid conflict. But every time she chooses truth over people-pleasing, the animus nods, and she grows more whole. The danger? Society doesn't like integrated women. They're too unpredictable, too hard to manipulate. They don't fit into boxes or play the game. And that threatens the illusion. So she'll be tested, judged, questioned, shamed. But if she stays rooted in awareness, she becomes untouchable. Integration isn't a one-time event. It's a ritual, a daily sacred commitment to wholeness. Some days she'll slide back. Some days she'll roar forward. But through it all, she keeps showing up. She learns that spirituality isn't escape. It's embodiment. And that changes everything. As her shadow softens and her animus steadies, a new self begins to emerge, one that doesn't seek approval or fear solitude, one that can hold space for grief, rage, joy, and peace all at once. That's not contradiction. That's compassion. That's what makes her dangerous in the most beautiful way, and she begins to see others differently too. She notices their shadows, their projections, their masks, but instead of judging, she understands. She sees through the performance, and sometimes her silence becomes a mirror that makes others squirm, because when you're authentic, you expose the fake. At some point, she realizes this inner work isn't just for her. It's ancestral. She's breaking cycles, healing wounds, dissolving inherited fear. Her solitude echoes through generations, backward and forward, and her ancestral wisdom becomes part of her voice, her body, her presence. But the journey doesn't end here. Shadow and animus are just the beginning. There are deeper waters to enter, realms where intuition becomes compass, and the soul becomes sovereign. She senses it, and as she takes a breath, she knows the real transformation is only just beginning, creating a sacred inner space. At some point, the noise outside stops mattering. You stop checking your phone for answers. You stop looking for signs from others, because something shifts. The urge to build not just a home, but a refuge inside. Yourself, a place where your soul can breathe without apology. This inner space isn't made of walls or furniture. It's built through attention, through tiny, deliberate moments, lighting a candle, closing your eyes, breathing deeply. These are not just actions, they're rituals. And ritual is what turns the ordinary into the sacred. Jung spoke of the symbolic life, a life where everything has meaning. When a woman chooses solitude, she finally has room for that meaning. Washing dishes becomes meditation. Drinking tea becomes a communion with the self. This is how spirituality returns, not in theory, but in rhythm. And slowly, she creates her temple. It might be a corner in her room, a playlist, a daily walk, but it's hers. No one can enter without permission. It's where intuition speaks louder than logic, and where silence becomes music. A place where truth is not debated, it's felt. The sacred inner space is where she begins to integrate her values into her body, not just talk about freedom, but feel it in her breath. Not just think about authenticity, but choose it even, when it costs her approval. This space becomes her sanctuary, and it protects her from spiritual amnesia, because the world is loud. And the minute you leave your temple, people will try to drag you back into distraction, comparison, chaos. But if your roots are deep, you'll bend, not break. That's the power of this space. It becomes your anchor, and anchors don't scream, they hold. What's wild is that this inner space starts to glow. Others feel it without knowing what it is. They're drawn to your presence, your calm, your clarity. But you know it's not charisma, it's coherence, it's integration, and it can't be faked or bought. Building this temple takes time and discipline. You'll want to abandon it. You'll doubt its importance. But over time, it becomes the most important place in your life, because it holds you when no one else does. It reminds you who you are, not in theory, but in vibration. Here, expectations die. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started living. You no longer need to prove, explain, or perform. You realize peace isn't found in control. It's found in surrender, and surrender isn't weakness, it's precision. A choice made from clarity. In this space, you start to heal, not from a place of urgency, but from trust. You realize that healing isn't always visible. Sometimes it's invisible shifts in how you speak to yourself, how you sit with discomfort. That's where compassion grows, in the quiet, in the waiting, and that compassion starts to shape your reality. You stop seeing yourself as broken. You stop expecting others to fix you. Instead, you become your own keeper, your own source. That's the essence of independence, not rejecting others, but refusing to abandon yourself. Eventually, this sacred space becomes your compass. When life throws chaos your way, you don't panic. You return. You sit. You listen. And in that stillness, awareness sharpens. Decisions become cleaner, relationships become mirrors, not cages, and life stops being noise. It becomes message. And yes, you'll be misunderstood. People will call you too quiet, too private, too intense, but they won't realize you're not hiding. You're tending to something ancient, something sacred, something more real than the performance everyone else is trapped in. Because when a woman builds a temple within, she stops chasing temples outside. She no longer begs for belonging. She belongs to herself. And in that belonging, she becomes unshakable, unbreakable, unstoppable. But even now, there's another truth waiting just beyond the stillness. Challenging social projections. There's something threatening about a woman who chooses to be alone, not because she's dangerous, but because she breaks the story society tells, that a woman's value is tied to being chosen. She steps out of that narrative, and suddenly, everyone gets uncomfortable. Jung called it projection, the tendency to assign our inner conflicts to others, and a solitary woman becomes a screen. People start projecting their fears of abandonment, their wounds around intimacy, their unresolved shame. But she's not the source of their pain. She's just the mirror. The irony? The more she minds her own life, the more people can't stop analyzing hers. She must be lonely. She's probably bitter. She gave up. But what if she found something deeper? What if solitude is her rebellion and her liberation? In solitude, she sees these projections clearly, and instead of absorbing them, she studies them. Like data, like symbols, she learns to decode what belongs to her and what doesn't. That's awareness, and awareness is the sword that cuts through inherited illusions. The projections don't just come from strangers. They come from family, friends, even other women. Don't you want someone? Aren't you afraid of growing old alone? These questions aren't curiosity. They're discomfort in disguise. They're resistance wearing a smile. But she doesn't fight them. She doesn't need to. Her life becomes her answer. Every peaceful morning, every intentional breath, every choice made from freedom, they speak louder than explanation. That's social authenticity, living truth without needing applause. Still, there are moments of doubt. Moments when the loneliness creeps in, when the projections start to stick. But instead of collapsing, she returns inward. She grounds herself in her inner process. She remembers, the noise outside doesn't change the truth inside, and the truth is this: the world fears what it doesn't understand. A woman who isn't seeking validation threatens the entire game. She exposes the performative nature of most relationships. She challenges the idea that love is earned through sacrifice and shrinking. That alone is revolution. The projections. Try to box her in, label her, reduce her. But she's fluid now. She doesn't fit in frames. She's become a moving question mark, one that forces others to confront their own inner contradictions. And some would rather blame her than face themselves. But here's the magic. The more she embodies herself, the less reactive she becomes. She doesn't defend or debate, she holds space, holds silence, holds sovereignty. And in that silence, people start hearing their own echoes. That's when real transformation begins. She understands now. Most people don't want truth. They want comfort. They want the illusion that everything is as it should be. But she's already broken through. She's seen the machinery. And once you see it, you can't go back to pretending. And as she walks through a world full of projections, she learns how to use them. Not to manipulate, but to clarify. Every judgment becomes an invitation to reflect. Every misunderstanding becomes a lesson in boundaries. And boundaries are how she protects her psychic balance. Eventually, she stops seeing projections as attacks. She sees them as information about culture, about fear, about what's still unhealed. She becomes a quiet force of disruption, not by shouting, but by existing, by being a living contradiction to societal expectations. And the more she embodies This awareness, the more she realizes, this isn't just about her. It's about all the women who came before, and those still hiding. Her life becomes a symbol, and from that symbol, something ancient begins to wake up. Awakening feminine wisdom. There's a kind of wisdom that doesn't shout. It whispers. It moves through dreams, symbols, gut feelings, and in the stillness of solitude, that wisdom starts to wake up. It's not logical. It's not linear. But it's ancient, and it knows exactly who you are, beneath all the noise. This is feminine wisdom, the kind that's been buried under centuries of noise, shame, and forgetting. In solitude, a woman clears the static. She begins to hear herself again, not the conditioned self, not the role-playing self, but the intuitive, feeling, wild self. Jung spoke of the anima, the feminine soul. But what happens when a woman reconnects to her own anima? She stops performing femininity and starts embodying it. She becomes rhythm instead of reaction, moonlight instead of spotlight, essence instead of effort. As she listens, something shifts. Her inner voice stops sounding like fear and starts sounding like truth. She trusts her no without guilt, her yes without compromise. That's the return of intuition, the most radical act in a world that worships logic and control. But feminine wisdom isn't passive. It's fire wrapped in velvet. It's creativity born from silence. It doesn't just feel, it transforms. She begins to move differently, speak differently. She chooses not from scarcity, but from sensing. And sensing is knowing. In this space, compassion deepens, not the kind that sacrifices herself for others, but the kind that holds everything without judgment. She feels her grief, her joy, her rage, and allows them all to breathe. That's the power of integration. No part of her is left behind. She stops trying to fix herself. She realizes she was never broken, only disconnected. And every ritual, every quiet moment, every tear shed in solitude becomes a thread that weaves her back to herself, to her body, to her authenticity. And then the world begins to respond, not because she's louder, but because she's more whole. Her presence becomes medicine, not through effort, but through energy. People feel her, even when she says nothing, because something inside her is finally aligned. That alignment brings peace, but also power. Not the kind that dominates, the kind that magnetizes. She no longer chases love, success, or belonging. She attracts by being, by vibrating truth. That's what happens when self-knowledge becomes embodiment. And from that embodiment, legacy begins, not in achievements, but in presence, in the way she looks at you, in the way she breathes, in the way she walks into a room and the air shifts. That's not performance. That's soul memory waking up. As this feminine wisdom deepens, she starts remembering what her mother forgot, what her grandmother was never allowed to say, what generations of women stored in silence. And her life becomes a bridge, a prayer, a reclamation of ancestral wisdom. This doesn't mean she abandons her masculine side. It means she stops letting it dominate. She lets her inner rhythms lead and lets the animus support. This dance between strength and surrender is where her psychic balance takes root. It's not about being one or the other. It's about being all. She becomes a keeper of cycles, of emotion, of intuition, of change. And in a world obsessed with certainty, she becomes a force of mystery. She doesn't need to explain it. She just lives it. And that life speaks louder than any theory ever could. But even now, even with all she's awakened, something deeper is still calling. A voice from the dark, sacred unknown, a next layer, a next truth. And as she turns inward once again, she knows. The feminine path doesn't end. It spirals, forever deeper. Solitude isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to unlearn who the world told you to be and remember who you truly are. So I'll ask you, when was the last time you were truly alone? and actually listened, not to your fears, but to your truth? Because maybe, just maybe, the woman you're becoming is waiting for you on the other side of silence. If this made sense to you, if something resonated deep inside, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay. With us on this journey, your transformation is already happening. Now let's walk it together.